The year is 1177, November 25th. Picture a landscape of rolling dust and blinding sun, the ancient hills of the Holy Land baking under a relentless sky. In the distance, a massive dark stain moves across the golden horizon, stretching as far as the eye can see. It is an army of terrifying proportions. 26,000 soldiers, perhaps as many as 30,000 depending on who you believe, are marching towards the holy city of Jerusalem. The ground trembles rhythmically under the hooves of Arabian stallions and the heavy tread of thousands of boots. At the head of this juggernaut rides a man whose name strikes fear into the heart of every Christian in the Near East, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West simply as Saladin. He is the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, a tactical genius who has united the Muslim world with a single purpose: to drive the Crusaders into the sea. But standing in his way is not a mighty emperor or a veteran general. It is a 16-year-old boy. And this boy is rotting alive. King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem is dying. His body is ravaged by leprosy, a disease that in the 12th century was considered a curse from God, a living purgatory. His skin is numb, his fingers are beginning to curl and decay, and he often hides his face behind veils or masks to conceal the disfigurement. To his enemies, he is a walking corpse. To his advisors, he is a liability. Yet, on this day, beneath the shadow of the true cross, this dying teenager will achieve the impossible. He is about to lead a suicidal charge of fewer than 500 knights into the teeth of Saladin's massive invasion force. What happens next will not just defy the odds. It will defy logic, rewriting the history of the Crusades in a single afternoon of blood and iron. To understand the miracle of Montgisard, we must first understand the depth of the crisis. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1177 was a realm living on borrowed time. It was a slender strip of Christian control surrounded by a sea of hostile forces. For decades, the Crusaders had relied on the disunity of their neighbors, playing Damascus against Cairo, keeping the Islamic world fractured. But Saladin had changed the game. He had conquered Egypt, seized Damascus, and encircled the Crusader states with a unified Ayyubid empire. The noose was tightening. When Saladin crossed the border that November, he didn't just bring an army. He brought an assumption of victory. He believed the kingdom was weak, led by a crippled child who could barely hold a set of reins. This underestimation was Saladin's first and most fatal mistake. He did not understand the nature of the boy he was fighting. Baldwin had been diagnosed as a child by his tutor, William of Tyre, who noticed that the prince felt no pain when other children pinched his arm. It was a death sentence, usually followed by exile to a leper colony. But Baldwin was not cast out. Against all tradition, the High Court of Jerusalem crowned him king. They saw a fire in him, a sharp intellect and a terrifying willpower that seemed to burn brighter as his body failed. By 1177, Baldwin was not ruling from a sickbed. He was ruling from the saddle. When news of Saladin's invasion reached him, Baldwin didn't cower in Jerusalem. He mustered every available man, a meager force of roughly 375 knights and a few thousand infantry, and rode south to the fortress of Ashkelon. It was a desperate move. He was essentially locking himself in a cage near the coast, hoping to block Saladin's path. Saladin, seeing the king trapped in Ashkelon, made his move. He simply ignored him. In a display of supreme arrogance, Saladin bypassed the fortress entirely, leaving a small detachment to keep Baldwin pinned down, and marched his main army toward the defenseless capital of Jerusalem. This was the nightmare scenario. Between Saladin and the Holy City, there was nothing. No army, no walls, no defense. The population of Jerusalem began to panic, flocking to the churches to pray for salvation. Saladin's army, confident that the leper king was neutralized, began to relax. They spread out across the countryside, pillaging villages, burning crops, and foraging for food. Their discipline evaporated. Why maintain formation when there is no enemy to fight? They were miles of scattered columns, weighed down by loot, marching casually toward what they thought was an inevitable victory. But here is what the chronicles don't tell you about the mind of Baldwin IV. Pain was his constant companion. He lived with a level of physical suffering that would break ordinary men, and this suffering had forged a mind of cold, hard steel. He was not afraid of death because he looked it in the mirror every morning. Realizing Saladin had passed him, Baldwin made a decision that terrified his advisors. He ordered the gates of Ashkelon to be opened. He wasn't going to wait for a siege. He was going to chase the largest army in the Middle East with a handful of men. The Crusaders broke out of Ashkelon, smashing through the small blockading force Saladin had left behind. They rode north, pushing their horses to the brink of collapse. It was a race against time, a silent, grueling march along the coast to intercept the Sultan before he reached Jerusalem. The sun beat down on them, the same sun that was currently baking the discipline out of Saladin's army. But while the Muslims slowed down, fat with confidence and loot, the Christians rode with the desperation of the damned. They knew that if they failed, their families in Jerusalem would be slaughtered or enslaved. On the afternoon of November 25th, near the hill of Mount Gisard, modern-day Ramla, the impossible happened. Saladin's army was crossing a wadi, a riverbed, struggling with their baggage train. They were completely unawares. Suddenly, the horizon to their rear shimmered. The banners of the Kingdom of Jerusalem appeared on the crest of the hill. The golden cross on a white field, and beside it, the most sacred relic in Christendom, the true cross carried by the Bishop of Bethlehem. Saladin was stunned. His scouts had failed him. He frantically tried to rally his troops, shouting orders to form lines to bring the baggage train to the center to ready the archers. But it was too late. The element of surprise is a weapon that multiplies numbers, and Baldwin held it firmly in his decaying hands. Baldwin dismounted his horse. This is one of the most cinematic moments in medieval history. The king, whose legs were numb and covered in sores, fell to his knees in the dust before the true cross. He prayed aloud, his voice cracking with emotion, tears streaming down his bandaged face. He asked God for victory, not for himself, but for his people. The sight of their crippled king, prostrated in the dirt, begging for divine intervention, sent a shockwave of adrenaline through the Crusader ranks. When Baldwin stood up, helped by his knights, the army was no longer a collection of frightened men. They were a single, fanatical entity. They remounted. The order was given, strike! The charge of the Crusader knights at Mount Gisard was like a thunderclap. 375 heavily armored knights, forming a wedge of solid steel, slammed into the disorganized center of Saladin's army. You have to understand the physics of a heavy cavalry charge to appreciate this violence. A knight on a destrier warhorse is a missile weighing nearly a ton, moving at 20 miles per hour. When hundreds of them hit a stationary line simultaneously, the impact is catastrophic. They smash through the Ayyubid ranks like a hammer through glass. At the tip of the spear was the Templar master Odo de Saint Amand, a man known for his ferocity. He and his 80 Templar knights drove straight for the yellow silk banners of Saladin himself. This was the strategy of the decapitation strike. Ignore the foot soldiers, ignore the flanks, kill the commander. The fighting was chaotic and brutal. The air was filled with the screams of dying men and horses, the clang of steel on steel, and the choking dust that turned the afternoon sun into a bloody haze. Saladin's Mamluk bodyguards, the elite slave soldiers of the East, fought desperately to protect their master. But they could not stop the momentum. The Crusaders were fighting with a fury that terrified the Muslim chroniclers. One writer described the Christians as having fire in their eyes, seemingly impervious to wounds. They carved a path of destruction straight toward the Sultan. Saladin, the great conqueror, watched as his personal guard was butchered around him. He saw the Templars closing in, their white mantles stained red with blood. For the first time in his career, Saladin felt the cold grip of mortal terror. He realized the battle was lost. His vast army, spread out over miles and caught unprepared, was dissolving into panic. The numerical advantage meant nothing because only a fraction of his troops could actually fight. The rest were blocking each other's retreat, trampling their own comrades in a frenzy to escape the iron wedge of the Crusaders. In a humiliating turn of events, Saladin was forced to flee. He abandoned his baggage, his treasures, and his army. According to legend, he escaped only by mounting a racing camel, speeding away into the desert night while his soldiers were cut down behind him. The slaughter that followed was absolute. The Crusaders pursued the fleeing enemy until nightfall. The invincible Ayyubid army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Those who weren't killed in the initial charge were hunted down by Bedouin raiders, or died of exposure in the cold rains that began to fall that evening. It is said that Saladin returned to Egypt with only 1/10 of his army. He entered Cairo not as a conqueror, but as a fugitive. In a letter to his brother, he wrote, "God does not want the kingdom of the Christians to fall yet." He was shaken to his core. He had been humbled by a boy who couldn't even hold a sword properly. But the cost of this victory for Baldwin was immense. The physical exertion of the battle accelerated his disease. The stress of the campaign weakened his already failing immune system. He had bought Jerusalem time, perhaps 10 or 20 years, but he had paid for it with the last remnants of his vitality. When the victorious army returned to Jerusalem, the scene was one of biblical jubilation. The church bells rang out across the valley. The people wept in the streets. They looked at their king, this frail, bandaged figure riding triumphantly through the gates, and they saw a saint. They called him the Savior of Jerusalem. For a brief moment, the leper king was the most powerful man on earth, having brought the Islamic superpower to its knees. The aftermath of Montgisard is a fascinating study in medieval logistics and consequences. The Crusaders captured an immense amount of booty, thousands of horses, camels, and weapons. But more importantly, they shattered the myth of Saladin's invincibility. For years, the Muslim world had viewed Saladin as unstoppable, the sword of Islam. Montgisard proved he could bleed. It encouraged rebellions in his own territories and forced him to spend years consolidating his power before he could threaten Jerusalem again. However, let's look closer at the man behind the victory. Baldwin's tragedy is that his greatest triumph was also the beginning of his end. The disease was merciless. In the years following the battle, he would go blind. He would lose the use of his hands and feet. He would eventually be unable to ride, carried instead on a litter. Yet, his mind remained sharp. Even on his deathbed, years later, when Saladin eventually returned, Baldwin would be carried to the front lines, his mere presence enough to hold the fractious Crusader lords together. He was the glue of the kingdom. The Battle of Montgisard stands out in history not just because of the tactics or the surprise, but because of the sheer human will involved. It is a testament to the power of the mind over the body. Here was a young man who had every excuse to give up. He was in constant pain, disfigured, and doomed to an early death. He could have abdicated. He could have hidden in his palace and let the generals manage the war. No one would have blamed him. But he didn't. He chose to lead from the front. He chose to ride into the jaws of death when he was already dying. This brings us to the deeper moral lesson of this story. We often judge power by physical strength, by the size of armies, or the vastness of wealth. Saladin had all of these. He had the numbers, the health, and the resources. By all metrics, he should have won. But Baldwin possessed something that cannot be measured by numbers: spirit. The indomitable human spirit that refuses to bow to circumstance. Baldwin 4 teaches us that our limitations are only as defined as we allow them to be. He showed us that a man can be rotting on the outside, yet possess a soul of pure iron. He proved that leadership is not about looking the part. It's about acting the part when the terror is real and the odds are impossible. In our own lives, we face our own Saladins, overwhelming odds, impossible situations, personal failings, or illnesses that seem to define our future. We look at the 35,000 arrayed against us and we want to retreat to the fortress. But the leper king whispers to us from the pages of history, "Open the gates, charge." The victory doesn't go to the one who is strongest. It goes to the one who is willing to sacrifice everything for a single moment of absolute clarity and courage. Baldwin saved Jerusalem not because he was a great king, but because he refused to be a victim. If you want to explore more of these incredible moments where history turned on a dime, where the weak conquered the strong and the lost were found, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell. We are building a library of the past's greatest lessons, and we want you on the front lines with us. Until next time.